All right, hello students, welcome back to CHRTC 309. This is Sociology of Youth and Religion. All right, so once again, we're going to look at a new topic now after parenting. We're going to talk about pinnacle moments, right? What's the influence of those sort of high points in life, those moments where you feel like you're on top of the world on religious faith. Okay, so what do we mean by a pinnacle moment? A pinnacle moment basically would be, a moment where people hit a high point in their lives, right? Now, in this case, we're talking about a spiritual high point of some kind. Generally, they express or reinvigorate a person's sense of connection between them and God, right? A personal connection between them and whatever deity, right? And this can be lots of different things, right? A moment of conversion, direct contact with the transcendent, or something like that. So, anytime that someone feels close to God, they've been born again, they feel the power of the Holy Spirit, right? They feel a sense of peace, like of nirvana, of connection with the universe. Any of these things could be kind of spiritual pinnacle moments. Now, the research here is from Mangloss, and Mangloss is principally dealing with the U.S., so we're principally dealing with Christianity, but depending on which religion we're talking about, it could be any number of things.
We often talk about Aldersgate Street or the Aldersgate experience as John Wesley's conversion experience. It represents a watershed moment in his spiritual journey. Somebody who has some sense of who God is and what God means and what God's about in their head, but doesn't feel it, or the Spirit stirs in him in a way that a dynamic connection is made between what he believes about God in his head and now what he feels and experiences about God in his heart, in his emotions.
I felt I did trust in Christ alone for salvation, and an assurance was given me that He had taken away my sins, even mine, and saved me from the law of sin and death.
It was the sense that God loved him, even him, that was life-changing.
In early 1738, John Wesley was at a low point, having just returned from his disappointing missionary efforts at the colony of Georgia in the New World. Wesley reluctantly attended a group meeting on the evening of May 24th on Aldersgate Street in London. As he heard a reading from Luther's preface to the Epistle to the Romans, he felt his heart strangely warmed.
He writes in his journal, I felt that God loved me. I experienced that God loved me. It was no longer something that was in my head, but it's something that I felt in my heart.
Wesley was the son of a preacher and grew up in a devoutly religious home, but the dynamic connection to God made at Aldersgate was new to him.
I think he came to his adulthood with one particular concept of how the religious life should work for him. And I think that's what he had to relearn. He had initially planned to live life in a certain way, and that was going to make a great relationship with God. And what Aldersgate taught him was he had to flip it. He'd gotten, unintentionally, the cart before the horse.
This reawakening of faith may happen many times in a person's journey. United Methodists set aside a day each year to celebrate the love of God in their own lives.
Aldersgate Sunday is a chance for us to do a little bit of spiritual inventory on our own. How am I experiencing God's love in my life?
This video was brought to you by the people of the United Methodist Church through World Service donations.
Okay, so Mangloss was interested in looking at a particular kind of pinnacle moment, which is miracles, right? So basically, what Mangloss says is that we can look at miracles in a couple of different ways, right? All right, so the first one, she says, is that they express cognitive beliefs about God that are reinforced by concrete experiences, right? So people who think that miracles are possible are going to have a certain vision of God, right? A certain vision of what the divine looks like. This is probably an omnibenevolent kind of force, one that can intervene in the lives of human beings to bring about goods, avoid evils, this kind of thing, right? And a being that cares. And then this gets backed up by concrete experiences, right? So something happens that people interpret as miraculous, right? Oh, it's a miracle. My Aunt Sheila was healed of her cancer, or whatever it happens to be, right? And I don't mean to make light of it. I'm not mocking it. I'm just saying that's kind of, the way it's constructed. And people then are using a belief in God to explain or interpret external events, right? In the face of maybe lack of another explanation for how something happened, they're interpreting an event. Or even if there is an explanation, right, that someone recovered from cancer, through chemotherapy, there can still be, people who interpret this as being miraculous, right? Especially say if it was a form of cancer that didn't have a particularly high survival rate, or maybe it was a miracle that was caught in time, right? There's all sorts of ways that people conceive these sorts of things. Okay, so this helps confirm a bond to God, right? If God cares about you enough to perform a miracle on your behalf or on behalf of someone you care about, then God must be there and must care. It's interesting, I think, because it helps people transform stressful events into positive ones, right? If God is there kind of guiding you through the process, then naturally, there must be a kind of positive aspect to it, right? And so it becomes, a time of great stress and anger, maybe existential questioning, to one where it's positive because, God was there intervening on my behalf. Okay, so the types of miracles that Mangloss said most young people tended to report were those associated with major life traumas, right? Illnesses, right? And so we're thinking here probably of an illness being diagnosed or an illness being cured that otherwise might not have been. Of accidents, right? Accidents, either not killing you or being narrowly avoided, right? Things that should have probably had a worse outcome, not having as bad of an outcome. Or death, the death of a loved one, something kind of miraculous associated with that, right? I struggle here to think of an example, but maybe, some good came out of it, right? I'm thinking like, Auntie Sheila died and Uncle Tommy, finally dealt with his alcoholism, right? And was cured of his alcoholism or something, right? Like maybe you have more imagination on this score than I do, but something around the death of a loved one, having been kind of miraculous. Okay, less prevalent, still present, are other kinds of stress, things like financial stress, right? Something bad happens on an interpersonal level, relationship breakdown, right? Divorce, financial stress. These are things, miracles associated with these sorts of things were a little bit less common. I mean, it's kind of interesting in a way, right? If you look at sort of the history of Catholic saints, right? Which I know all of you spend your off hours looking at the history of Catholic saints. One of the things that has to happen, for someone to go and become a Catholic saint, right, is they have to have 2 confirmed miracles, right? 2 miracles confirmed after, posthumously, so after they've died. They have to be prayer to them has to be associated with, or their intercession has to be associated with 2 miracles. What's interesting about this, at least for me, is that when you look back at the history, right, a lot of these things are very situational, right, and have to do a lot of times with, things that are prevalent at the time that the miracle is reported. So, for instance, right now, when we look at a lot of miracles that are attributed to new Catholic saints, a lot of them have to do with cancer, right? Cancer, I guess, in our society is a particular scourge. It just so happens that, lots of people die from cancer. It's somewhat incurable, right? It takes a lot of lives. It's devastating in lots of cases. But if you go back, to the 19th century, a lot of miracles were associated with things like tuberculosis, and prior to that, things like leprosy, right? And so a lot of, what people will consider miraculous in a sense, or where miracles seem to show up, and of course you can come up with a supernatural explanation for this as well. I'm offering probably more of a naturalistic one than I mean to, but it does seem that people associate certain things with needing miraculous intervention, right? And so when we see these patterns in young people, it's probable that these are the kinds of things that they worry about, right? The things that are affecting them more so than financial stress or other sorts of things, right? That they might not be dealing with as much. Okay, another kind of funny feature of this is that for whatever reason, evangelical Protestant young adults are far more likely to report miraculous occurrences than other young adults. So this includes, mainline Protestants, Roman Catholics, the nuns, obviously, and anyone who's agnostic or atheist, which those ones kind of make sense. But, why would evangelical young people be more likely to report miracles than, say, Roman Catholics, right? They share roughly the same belief structure, right? The actual cosmologies and theologies, while somewhat different, are relatively the same in many ways. So why then would evangelicals be more likely to believe that they had miracles? Well, it comes down to this particular sort of notion in evangelical sort of theology, which is the stress on people having a personal relationship with Jesus, at least according to Mangloss. Her theory is that it's all down to this idea of having a personal relationship with Jesus. Now, again, I think this is in some ways kind of funny in the sense that, Roman Catholics have a long history of miracles, right? And like I said on the previous slide, Roman Catholics, believe that every saint has to have produced, or, has to have had confirmed at least 2 instances of a miracle having been performed. And so, you would think that at the end of the day, Roman Catholics might be more likely than evangelicals, who don't have this kind of theology that miracles are a kind of common, everyday commonplace. And yet Mangloss thinks that this idea that, you are personally connected with God is the thing that probably makes the difference. And it kind of makes sense, right? It makes sense, in the following way. If you believe that you have a personal relationship with God or with Jesus, who is God in evangelicalism and Roman Catholicism and all forms of Christianity, well, then this is a God that is particularly interested in you, right? This is not a God that is kind of distant. And, in a sense, it would make it more, this kind of personalizing of the deity as being personally connected to you specifically, not, your group, not your church, not some long dead, religious organization or whatever, or long living, ancient religious organization, but you kind of personally means that God's interested in you, right? And that God may do things for you. So if you experience something in your personal life, right? Something that you can't explain, that seems out of the ordinary, that was even maybe just a response to a prayer that you made, if you think that this deity is specifically interested in you, I would say you're much more likely to attribute, the cause of this unknown event to God. Now, I would suspect, if I were guessing, that these differences should disappear a little bit over time. Just in particular because this kind of mode of, the Protestant or evangelical Protestant especially, idea of a personal relationship with God has sort of been smuggled into Roman Catholicism in all sorts of ways, right? It has become sort of a cultural mode of Christianity. And so, you can hear now, I think, Roman Catholics expressing the same kind of sentiment that you have to have a personal relationship with God in ways that you might not have heard a couple of decades ago, right? But, so powerful has been the sort of influence of evangelicalism, particularly from the 90s, or the 1990s, that it sort of moved in everywhere. So I suspect that if you redid, this study, probably with Gen Z, you would find less of a difference between Catholics and evangelicals than Mangloss found. So those that experience these kind of pinnacle moments, that have, these moments of deep connection with God, basically are more likely to say that they are highly satisfied or very satisfied with their lives, right? Now, this sort of makes sense, right? Well, for one, these pinnacle moments basically reduce stress, right? They take these kind of stressful moments and turn them into positive moments. So they attenuate certain forms of stress. And people have experienced, these kinds of connections, right? Miraculous healings or whatever. If you really feel that deep connection that God is on your side, right? If God is for us, who can be against us? To put it in explicitly Christian terms, right? I mean, it kind of makes sense, right? If this God has shown a distinct interest in you to the extent that, they've intervened on your behalf and changed the physical reality of the world, well, I mean, what do you have to worry about, right? You're definitely in a good kind of place. Religious experience leads to a stronger sense of connection with God and his reality in the world, right? And again, this is potentially, very profoundly reassuring. And I mean, we talked about, when we talked about parental loss, the way that, religious faith has all of these conduits that are good at kind of dispersing or, softening the blows of life, right? And this is kind of it, right? Like, if you're in, let's say, a more positive way than say, the death of a parent would be sort of a pit moment or a valley moment, right? Where you're hitting the bottom of the wave. A pinnacle moment is a kind of high moment. But these religious traditions, right? Religious traditions have these sort of codes and these quick cheat sheets of how to get through life and what life means. And so when you get something that confirms your religious beliefs, right? You go through certain religious actions or you interpret phenomenon as having, some religious meaning, it's not surprising that you would feel a greater connection and therefore reduced anxiety. Okay, so interesting. We get back to families here. Families all the time. So divorce. Youth whose parents had divorced were less likely to experience a miracle than those with intact families. And Mangloss, again, puts this down to the broken bond with God that seems to occur from the collapse of their parents' marriages. So once again, right, we talked about this, that young people will inscribe their parents' marriages with a sort of religious aspect, right? Their parents' religiosity informs their parents' relationship. So they've sacralized, in a sense, their parents' marriages. If those marriages break down, well, lo and behold, what do you get? You get a sort of sacred loss or desecration, right? So this seems to reduce the way that their ability to interpret events in life as ultimately being miraculous, right? And again, this makes sense, right? You see the world through the lens you have, right? If you have a lens that says, that God is omnibenevolent, and your family's happy life is connected with their life in God, right? You're going to get a different kind of output at the end of the day. I think this completely makes sense. I find nothing controversial about this. It makes a good deal of sense. Now, if you lose that, right, you might experience the very same events, right? You might have, someone being cured of a disease that they shouldn't have been, or going into remission of cancer when it was unlikely, surviving an accident, not being as badly injured, all the same things. But because you're no longer seeing the world through the same sacred lens, you're going to interpret the world very differently. And that, really does seem to be what is happening, right? According to Mangloss, right? That broken bond that's created by the failure of a parent's marriage ultimately just means you interpret the world in a completely different way. So one of the other things that Mangloss suggests is that religious identities are today a lot more flexible than they were in the past, right? And this kind of makes sense, right? That definition of modernity, again, that's given by Harwas, that modernity, creates people who think they should have no story except the story they chose when they had no story, right? And that this is freedom, right? This applies really to religious identities as well, right? Our identities very much in the kind of modern era are a function of our personal choices, right? We get to choose who we are. And right, if you're born into a religious family, right, you're born into a Roman Catholic family, there's nothing saying that you must remain Roman Catholic, right? At some point in your life, it's sort of assumed now that you're going to make a choice, right? That you're going to choose whether to take on that faith for yourself. This was not so much the case in the past, right? Where if you were born Roman Catholic, you were Roman Catholic, and only a fairly cataclysmic or seismic transformation was going to shift you to not Roman Catholic, right? It's not a small thing in the past, right? People lost their whole lives. Not physically necessarily, but certainly their livelihoods, all of their social connections from shifting religions. And so it was something that was done with great difficulty. Today it's done with great ease, right? How many friends I have who just, decided that they weren't Roman Catholic anymore, right? Who just decided they weren't evangelical anymore, who have just left religion altogether because it didn't appeal to them, right? And it is, in a sense, no more difficult a choice in a lot of ways than any other choice about who you are, right? It's not something that's deeply rooted in the ways that maybe it was in the past. Okay, so because now our identities are anchored in things like our subjective view of the world, our personal experiences, personal choices and satisfaction, what Mangloss suggests is that religious identities now require a different kind of experience to support them, right? So people are looking, when it comes to young people looking to categorize their religious identities, they're looking for religious experiences or irreligious experiences that would anchor down, who they are as a way of measuring the validity of who they are and how they are choosing to identify, right? It's because identity, when we talk about the modern self, is much more focused internally, right? What I feel like I am, and then looking for experiences that would ultimately link back to that and confirm my sort of sense of my own identity, right? That's how we do identity in late modernity, right? We aren't set by the outside forces, we're set by inside forces, and then we look for confirmation. Now, Mangloss says that, there's less focus now on rational argumentation than on what people have directly experienced, right? And you hear this, right? You hear this in the language that's even used academically now, right? We talk about people's lived experiences as sort of the gold test for who they are, right? We're really concerned with the lived experiences that people have as, validating their identity, as validating who they are, as validating what their worth is, as validating truth, right? Lived experience is a validation of truth. When you talk about lived experience, you're making a truth claim. Now, again, I don't want to make, and I don't think Mangloss is making the case that young people are not rational, right? But I think the way we construct our identity falls into, I think, a category that you might rightly call emotivism, right? That is deeply based in emotions. And this is certainly the case that Carl Trueman makes in his book, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, right? That so much of our identities now are based in emotion, in emotivism. So we find things in emotional experiences and things that have emotional resonance rather than, being talked into positions because they rationally make sense, right? So, I mean, this is why there'll be a lot of people who will argue that, a lot of the work of so-called apologists, right, religious apologists, people who try to make an intellectual defense of particular religious traditions, is a bit wasted on Gen Z a little bit, because it's going with this highly rationalistic mode of arguing people into religion. And does that actually work, right? Is this a mode of being that ultimately works for, say Gen millennials and Gen Z? And I think like Carl Trueman would suggest that this is not the case, right? That this is, an emotivist generation, that they're really attuned to feelings, sentiments, and these sorts of things, rather than, rationalistic kind of argumentation. Okay, so all good there. If you're kind of more attuned to these emotive sorts of arguments, right, and these emotive experiences as ways of confirming faith, right, pinnacle moments are going to matter. Why? Because pinnacle moments tend to be emotional moments, right? They're moments where, something happens that affects you on a deep and personal level. And that those emotions are then confirmatory of your beliefs, right? Okay, so that makes sense, right? If you are in a generation, and I think Gen Z is definitely kind of there, that is defined by something like emotivism as a main mode of being in the world, and of identifying and figuring out who they are, what feels right, then, emotional kind of experiences are going to be the most powerful markers. I think nothing too controversial there. So what seems obvious then is that certain denominations, we're talking Christianity here again, are better at providing faith pinnacle moments than others. And maybe as much, they're better at framing pinnacle moments as religious experiences, right? They're better at sort of saying that thing you experienced, that was God. Maybe because their language and the sort of theology that flows through them ultimately suggests in lots of ways that God is, present all the time and doing lots and lots of things in the world, right? That would then sort of make sense. Okay. So evangelical Christians, right, in themselves sort of, in lots of ways, emergent from modernity, right? When we talk about like what faith is the most modern, you probably, in terms of Christians, you'd probably have to put evangelical Christians somewhere high in there, right? And if you look at the kind of outflow of a lot of evangelical Christian worship services, right, they are kind of fundamentally emotional in lots of ways, right? They have big dramatic music, they have your oceans where feet may fail kind of tunes, right, that really speak on an emotional level to a lot of people, right, that connect, kind of the heart with God more than they do maybe, preach good theology. A lot of the play is on emotions in sermons in a lot of ways, right? Even this sort of notion of a personal relationship with God or with Jesus, right? This is a very emotive kind of terms. So, maybe not surprisingly, they're better at connecting sort of personal experiences in the world with God, right? Because they're like, experience emotion, boom, connection. Okay, so we have here sort of two possible theoretical mechanisms that explain why experience grounds faith, right? Okay, so one of these we call belief and desire reinforcement. Okay, so basically, most people want in some way for their beliefs, their, beliefs about what's right and wrong to be fortified in some way, right? That these kinds of faith experiences, right, these pinnacle moments can cognitively and emotionally kind of ground your moral beliefs about what's true and good and right in life, right? So it's like, all right, I'm having this religious experience that I feel confirms that, say God is real, this is who he is, and this is what's right and wrong in the world. Or not so much that this is who God is, right? That I have the right vision of God, right? That my personal relationship is a reflection of something that's real. Okay. So, someone has a spiritual experience. It allows them to then kind of lock in their beliefs, right? Because it's like, okay, clearly, because I've had this religious and spiritual experience, that means my vision of the divine is correct, right? So, on the second point, religious experience play a strong role in supporting the overall belief system a person has, right? It grounds it again in reality, right? It's like, I had this religious experience that confirms to me my vision of the world is correct, right? And so my vision of what's right and wrong, my whole kind of sense of the world, my worldview, ends up being strongly confirmed by these sort of experiences. Okay, so this one from Smith et al. I think Longest is one of the other authors, Kyle Longest, who's a great sociologist of religion in his own right. Say in the book Young Catholic America, another piece out of the National Study of Youth and Religion, not surprisingly, the more religious experiences a person reports, the more likely they are to fall into the category of highly religious. Now, this could be a little bit of a chicken and egg thing, right? Do more people who are more highly religious interpret more things as religious experiences, or does having more religious experiences push someone to become more highly religious? The directionality here, I think, is not entirely clear to me. I mean, I would be warm, I think, to the notion that yes, the people, more religious experiences are going to lead someone to being more highly religious. But I have to be open to the possibility that the directionality is opposite, right? That more highly religious people interpret more things as religious experiences. Regardless, right? We have here, right, that people with more religious experiences likely are going to have their kind of worldview reinforced more. People reinforce their worldview, their religious belief through religious experiences. No surprise there, right? Someone who's praying and feels, like John Wesley, the founder of Methodism, did, strangely warmed, like the Holy Spirit is warming up their heart. That is, that can ground and reinforce their religious beliefs, right? John Wesley had a particular set of religious beliefs. That feeling of being strangely warmed confirmed it for him. I think this last point is important. One of the things that needs to happen for these, for this to be possible is there need to be opportunities to have religious experiences, right? And clearly, I think some denominations and some faith groups are better at providing chances to have authentic religious experiences than others, right? I don't want to throw any shade on Roman Catholicism, but I think it is pretty clear that it can be hard for a lot of people in the highly structured kind of environment of Roman Catholicism to have these sort of spontaneous religious experiences. And because so much is given to process, right, where for young people, some of the spots where they might get religious experiences is maybe somewhat understressed, right? Because the Mass, the Mass, the celebration, on Sundays and every day is the source and summit of the Christian life. I guess the Eucharist is the source and summit of the Christian life for Roman Catholics, right? Other aspects and other things that might offer chances for religious experiences might be a little bit deprecated. And that would make evangelicals, I think, better at maybe providing these more spontaneous moments of religious experience than Roman Catholics are. Again, I'm not going to say that evangelicals are perfect. They're certainly not. They have their own sort of unique flaws. Just a kind of thought, right? That some groups might be better at offering spaces where this is possible. All right, another kind of theoretical mechanism that we can sort of posit is that religious experiences may ultimately sort of stem from a drive for identity continuity, right? It is hard, I think. I've made it sound like it's easy to change religious faiths, but I think a lot of people do struggle with it. Maybe I'm being a little bit too Christian Smith, moralistic therapeutic deism, where he makes it seem easy. And I should think a little bit more like Josh Packard, who said, to me, specifically that, he thought MTD was a bad idea because it made it sound like young people take faith really lightly. And he felt like young people take faith really, really seriously, right? And they struggle with it and they fight with it. And if they abandon it, they abandon it after a great deal of struggle. And I think this makes sense. Like if you look at this point, right, most of us have a desire to maintain an identity continuity. I think no one wants to generally accept that they may have given their lives or believed things that were false, right? This is why people fall into ego defense, right? Where they can ignore vast amounts of factual evidence that proves their cherished positions wrong. So we all have this sense that we want to maintain the continuity of our identities, reinforce beliefs that we had, at least in some way, supporting them and holding them together, right? And so what Mangloss suggests is that religious experiences can help shore up the sense of the self, right? Feeling strangely warmed, as John Wesley did, can make you feel like you're truly saved, or like Jesus loves you, or whatever. Like you have the right identity, and your identity is true because it's backed up by these experiences. And I think, these pinnacle moments are really key in building up those moments. And people who obviously have more of them then are going to say they're stronger in their identities, and that sort of makes sense, right? They have more things backing up that continuity of identity.